So thank you very much, Thomas, for accepting our invitation to our PROTEUS seminar series. Thomas Johansen is a professor at University of Oslo. He will talk about a topic that is very close to the discussions that we had as a group and to the aims of the project. His talk is entitled "The Cosmos as a Model of Self-Sufficiency." And of course, Plato will be the special second guest of our talk today. So thank you very much, Thomas, and you can go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Sylvia. Of course, I'd much prefer to be in Barcelona, particularly as it's about -10 in Oslo, but I hope to have that pleasure another time. So my paper is not about time in the time years, nor is it particularly about Aristotle, and I know you have an interest as a group in Aristotle's reception of the time years. But I shall bring in Aristotle in relation to my subject, which I suppose can be defended in the context as being about something very basic about the cosmos that will also provide the background for any discussion of time. So I put the text that I'm going to be talking about, and it's a particular passage right at the beginning of Tamiya's account. I put that in chat as a file. I sent it around in advance, but you can look at it there. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to share my paper as I read it out or talk through it on the screen so you can follow it. I mean, I think that might be useful, both if the sound quality drops a bit and also if there are words that are not entirely clear. Okay, so I'll do that now. Right, so self-sufficiency, in Greek autarkeia, is a commonly recognized characteristic of the good life amongst ancient philosophers. Aristotle uses it alongside completeness or perfection, to teleion, as one of the criteria of the human good. Again, Plato, self-sufficiency serves alongside perfection as conditions of the good. While for Epicurus, self-sufficiency is referred to as the as a great good in the letter to Menoikeus, a good that arises from the proper attitude to pleasure. What is less commonly recognized is the way self-sufficiency regulates Plato's accounts of the cosmos. In one way, there's nothing surprising about this, since Plato's cosmos is a god, and self-sufficiency for both Plato and the other philosophers I mentioned is a hallmark of the gods. In its application of self-sufficiency, Plato's cosmology displays its deep explanatory connections with his ethics, his theology, and ultimately the theory of forms. My work today is to explain this connection. Let me say a bit first about the word self-sufficient. Self-sufficient, autarkias, has a continuum of meanings. The most common gloss is lacking in nothing, with the implication of the element out, from auto, self, that one is lacking in nothing because of one's own resourcefulness. Hence, the term also has the meaning of able to provide for oneself, able to execute one's function without relying on others. There's a passage in the Politicus there about how the gods, the various gods are self-sufficient in relation to their followers. That's to say, they are able themselves, without interference, to do their job. and the senses of being self-reliant and independent. The term is commonly applied not just to individuals, man or God, but also to whole communities or cities. So in the Republic, we're told that the city comes about because none of us is self-sufficient, but we all need many things. While in Herodotus, Solon explains to Croesus that it is impossible for one who's only human to obtain all these things at the same time, just as no land is self-sufficient in what it produces. Each country has one thing but lacks another. Whichever has the most is the best. Just so no human being is self-sufficient. Each person has one thing but lacks another. Here the two senses, the two contexts come together, the social, the societal, and the individual context. The passage we shall be looking at in the Timaeus follows shortly after Timaeus has set out the basic principle of the creation, which is that the divine creator wanted to make a world as like himself as possible, and that means as good as possible. Having reasoned that the best for a visible corporeal entity, like the cosmos, is to have reason, and that this, for such an entity, means having a soul, he concludes that the best cosmos is an animal, a combination of a body and a soul. The best animal, in turn, is one fashioned after an eternal model. And the best model is a complete one, a teleos one. Complete means, in the first instance, containing all the parts, which for an animal taken generically means containing within it all the different kinds of animal within it. The visible cosmos will correspond to the best possible by containing within itself all the different kinds of animals. That becomes an important point in the creation story as we get to the creation of man and later the various sorts of animals. But a further twist on complete is that Timaeus also takes it to imply uniqueness. The thought is that if there was a further animal, sorry, I left something out there, if there was a further animal, then neither of those two animals themselves would be complete, and they would emerge as parts in relation to some higher, more comprehensive animal. And so each of the two animals included would not individually be complete and so not maximally good. We don't have to go into the details of this famous argument, which Keat made Keat refer to the demiurge as mad. The main point for our purposes is that the completeness from the beginning of the account emerges as one of the key characteristics in maximizing the goodness of the cosmos. Timaeus then turns to the composition of the world body. Four basic bodies are tied together by geometrical proportion to form a whole unified in friendship, philia, and insolvable apart from the demiurge himself. Okay, that's the background then. We've got this far in the Timaeus, and now we come to the passage that I shall be looking at in more detail. The construction of the world used up the whole of each of these four bodies. For the Creator constructed it of all the fire and water and air and earth available, leaving over no part or power of any of them, reasoning in the following way. Firstly, so that the living being should as far as possible be a complete one of complete parts, and further, so that it should be one inasmuch as there would be nothing left over out of which another such thing could come into being, and finally, that it should be ageless and free from disease. For he knew that heat and cold and other things that have powerful effects surround and attack a composite body from without, so causing untimely dissolution, and make it decay by bringing disease and old age upon it. For this reason, and by this reasoning, he made the world one complete whole, consisting of parts that are all wholes, and subject neither to age nor to disease. The shape he gave it was suitable and akin to its nature. A suitable shape for a living being that was contained within itself, all living beings, would be a figure that contains all possible figures within itself. Therefore, he turned it into a rounded spherical shape, with the extremes equidistant in all directions from the center, the figure that of all is the most complete and like itself, as he judged likeness to be incalculably superior to its opposite. and he gave it a perfectly smooth external finish all around for many reasons. For it had no eyes, no need of eyes, as there remained nothing visible outside it, nor of hearing, as there remained nothing audible. There was no surrounding air, which it needed to breathe in, nor was it in need of any organ by which to take food into itself and discharge it later after digestion. Nothing was taken from it or added to it, for there was nothing that could be. It supplied its own nourishment from its own decay, and by craft it had come into being in such a way that it suffered and did everything in itself and by itself, as its constructor thought that it would be better being self-sufficient, there's the word, than dependent on anything else. He didn't think there was any purpose in attaching hands to it, as it had no need to grasp anything or defend itself, nor with feet or any other means of support, for he allotted it the motion proper to its body, which of the 7 motions is the one which especially attaches to intelligence and wisdom, and by leading it around, he made it move in a circle, spinning uniformly around its axis on the same spot. Any deviation into movement of the 6 kinds he entirely precluded. And because for its revolution it needed no feet, he created it without feet or legs. Having completed this entire reasoning about the God that was going to be at some point, the God that always is, made it smooth and even all over, with every point on its surface equidistant from the center, a body whole and complete whose components were also complete bodies. And he put its soul in the center and stretched it throughout the whole and covered the body within it. So he established one heaven only, round and moving around, solitary, but because of its excellence, needing no company other than itself, and satisfied to be its own acquaintance and friend. His creation, then, for all these reasons, was a blessed God. Now, let me say a bit about self-sufficiency in Aristotle, because this, in a way, is the most famous place of departure for us in ancient philosophy when we think about self-sufficiency in relation to the good life. So in 1.7, self-sufficiency is one of 2 closely related criteria of the human good. The first one is completeness, in the sense of that which one desires only for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. Aristotle argues that on this criterion, happiness is the good. And then he seeks to demonstrate that the same point, that happiness is the good, follows also from a consideration of self-sufficiency. He says, from the point of view of self-sufficiency, the same result seems to follow, for the final good is thought to be self-sufficient. Now, by self-sufficient, we don't mean that which is sufficient for a man by himself, for one who lives a solitary life, but also for parents, children, and wife, and in general for his friends and fellow citizens, since man is born for citizenship. But some limit must be set to this, for if we extend our requirement to our ancestors and descendants and friends' friends, we're in for an infinite series. Let us examine this question, however, on another occasion. The self-sufficient we now define as that which, when isolated, makes life desirable and lacking in nothing, and such we think happiness to be. And further, we think it most desirable of all things, without being counted as one good thing among others. If it were so counted, it would clearly be made more desirable by the addition of even the least of goods. For that which is added becomes an excess of goods, and of goods the greater is always more desirable. Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. So we have these 2 criteria of completeness, of finality, and self-sufficiency. And we might put the connection between the 2 something like this. Just as what is desirable but not more desirable for the sake of something else is the most desirable and so the best, so that which is desirable but not more desirable by the addition of anything else is the most desirable and so the best. The same conclusion follows then from the additive consideration as it does from the means end consideration. One might see the means end consideration as a form of additive consideration. Some things are more desirable because they also lead to something else. Adding in this further end will make this something more desirable. This passage now that I've very briefly referred to in Aristotle, offers, I think, the best known use of the two criteria to characterize the good life. But they are, as is also well recognized, first introduced together by Plato for the same purpose, characterizing the good life in the Philebus, in this passage, where Socrates says, "Is it the fate of the good to be of necessity in the category of the complete, or teleon, or the incomplete, PROTEUS, in that of the most complete of all, of course? And will the good be something sufficient? He cannot, of course, more so than anything else. One thing about it one cannot readily deny is that everything capable of knowing pursues it, longing to take hold of it and possess it. And they all make no account of anything else unless its accomplishment involves some good. That's undeniable." Socrates here uses the term sufficient, hikanon, but he later uses autarkia to rephrase the criterion. He uses this criterion then in our passage, in the passage just quoted, or after the passage just quoted, to exclude both the life of pleasure and the life of knowledge, taken in isolation as being the good life. For neither would be complete for a human being, even if pleasure might do for a clam or an oyster, and knowledge for a god. But something would be missing from a human life that just involved one of those components. So neither of those lives would be sufficient for a human being. Now, turning to our passage again, in the Timaeus, a similarly close connection between completeness and self-sufficiency can be observed. Let's look at how the two terms work in our passage. The complete, the teleon, or as is sometimes translated the perfect, comes first in Timaeus' treatment. I'm going to prefer complete to perfect as a translation. And that's because, not because I think there's an opposition between the two terms, but because I think complete is in a way more basic to the argument. The primary sense seems clearly to be complete, the sense of teleon, since Timaeus argues from the premise that all of the materials have been used in the creation of the cosmos. That in itself would not make the cosmos perfect, but it does mean that the cosmos completes all the materials available. As you might say when you finish stacking all the logs, that the job is complete. However, complete also here qualifies a whole, and it's clear that a whole is a harmonious structure, not just a sum of parts. So completing the whole means in this way adding all the parts required to make it a harmonious structure, and so perfecting it as a whole. Note also that the parts themselves are not just perfect, but also wholes. So the whole is a whole of wholes, and it's a perfect whole of perfect wholes. And this is explained as perfection of the parts. Each of the four simple bodies is explained by their proportionality internally. Of course, they are composed of triangles, as we shall learn, but they also amongst each other, in relation to each other, in proportionality, and as we heard at the beginning of this paper, in friendship. There's a sense then in which if all the parts are present in this kind of whole, then it's not just complete, but also perfect. But this perfection is a function of its being a complete whole. That's my point. Completeness seems again to be the issue when Timaeus argues that the cosmos is spherical, for he introduces the containment relation, perieiche in Greek, between the whole and its parts. The spherical shape is roomy, spacious, in a way that ensures that nothing falls outside of it. A suitable shape, as he says, for a living being that was to contain within itself all living beings would be a figure that contains, perieiche, all possible figures within itself. Clearly, the point here is related to Timaeus' earlier claim that I talked about at the beginning of the paper, that just as the animal that the demiurge used as his model contained all the kinds of animals, so the visible cosmos contained all the visible kinds of animals. As we were told there, nothing could come to be beautiful which is like the incomplete. Completion then is a necessary condition of beauty, though it's not said that it's a sufficient condition. One might say that it's only when a certain kind of thing, a whole like an animal, is completed that we have a thing of beauty. Again, it's not quite the point that completeness on its own ensures beauty or perfection, but it is when used to qualify a certain kind of thing as complete. Returning again to our passage, it's completeness that also ensures that there's nothing outside of the cosmos. Here again, the implication of completeness is not just that there's nothing outside from which another whole like the cosmos could be formed, as Tamiya says. The claim is also that there are no bodies at all outside of the cosmos. As one might say, since there's nothing at all outside of the cosmos, a fortiori, there's nothing out of which another cosmos could be made. For it's a total absence of external materials that ensures that the cosmos cannot be affected, either so as to perceive or so as to age or suffer any decay. Of course, even if there's nothing outside the cosmos, this does not ensure that there couldn't be. There's a range of reasons one might give why there couldn't be. One would be that there was no void outside of the cosmos into which materials could move. But there's no indication here of such a claim. Indeed, the point that the demiurge did not give legs to the cosmos because it moved only in a circle would be redundant if there was no space outside of it that it in principle could move into. Another reason would be if the absence of material outside of the cosmos would mean the absence also of a material to which material inside the cosmos would be attracted. As matter is said earlier in the pre-cosmos to move to its like, one might think that this would be a sufficient reason for no matter to move outside of the cosmos. There's nothing outside of it that the matter inside the cosmos would be attracted to. One might, for example, imagine some material escaping the cosmos and afterwards affecting the cosmos from the outside. The question then would be what ensures that the matter does not escape the cosmos as it is. Timaeus will later explain that the world soul, which surrounds the world body, exerts a sort of centripetal force on its elements, compressing them inside the cosmos. We do have in our passage a reference to the revolution of the world body and suffusion by the world soul, but there's nothing specific in our passage to suggest this kind of answer. There's clearly a close relationship between being complete in the sense of having no parts missing and being complete in the sense of having no need for further parts. Which parts you have a need for is a question of which functions you're required to or it would be good for you to execute. So Timaeus does not give eyes, ears, feet, and such parts to the cosmos because it has no use for them. Timaeus does not explicate, as Aristotle does in his biological works, a teleological principle of the sort nature or God only equips organisms with parts for which they have a need. It doesn't give anything superfluous to organisms. The thought may be implicit in the passage, but there's also the additional consideration that any such part would not just be superfluous, but ruin the smooth sphericity of the cosmos. The question of need brings us to self-sufficiency, standardly glossed, as we saw at the beginning, as not being in need of anything. In our passage, self-sufficiency is mentioned in immediate extension of nutrition, the ability of the cosmos to recycle its own materials without the need characteristic of other animals for external nourishment. That explains why the cosmos has no organs of ingestion or excretion. Similarly, the cosmos has no hands or legs because it has no need to grasp objects or to support itself, there being nothing outside of it to support itself on. Notice here, by the way, the use of organ, organon. This is not the only or first case in Plato of organon being used for instrumental body parts. But the other uses are, as far as I can tell, reserved for perception. Of course, there's a famous passage in the Theaetetus, where the eyes and the ears and so on are referred to as organa, though that's qualified by a hoion, a like, so like organs. But here there seems to be a fairly sort of unqualified general understanding that we can refer to these parts as organa, as instruments. One might express the relationship between completion and self-sufficiency by saying that while completion is primarily a compositional notion, being a certain whole out of certain parts, self-sufficiency is functional, indicating the wherewithal to execute the requisite or the desirable functions. Sometimes, as in the Philebus, self-sufficiency is expressed by the notion of being sufficient, hikanos, without the self bit, the auto bit. But the difference, we remember that hikanos also means competent, having the ability to do something, pointing to one's ability oneself to execute the function. The self bit is crucial, whether explicit or implicit, since it's clearly possible to not be in need of anything, yet also be totally reliant on others. The spoiled baby would be an example. One strategy for being self-sufficient, the Epicurean one, is to have as few needs as possible, as modest needs and as possible, and needs that are as easy to satisfy as possible. This implies self-sufficiency as such. You could in principle have as many needs as you like, as long as you're able to satisfy them yourself. An Epicurean might object that having more needs increases the risk of not being able to satisfy them, and that would clearly be true if the satisfaction of one's needs is dependent on contingent external factors. If we go back to the cosmos, Timaeus' point in the passage does not seem to be that he wants to reduce the needs of the cosmos as such, but rather to stress that the needs that the cosmos has are such that they can be internally satisfied. So, for example, the point is not to deny that the cosmos needs nutriment, though Timaeus could have chosen not to have represented movement of materials within the cosmos as nutrition, but rather to show that it is a form of nutrition that the cosmos can execute internally by itself. It is this notion of self-sufficiency that Aristotle applies in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics when he argues that contemplation is the most self-sufficient activity because it requires only one's own resources, the activity of the knowledge that one has already acquired. It is possible to adopt an extended notion of self-sufficiency whereby a being is self-sufficient not just if it's able to execute its functions independently once it has come into being, but is also responsible for its own being in the first place. In this sense, only a necessary existent will be self-sufficient. Clearly, the cosmos as created is not self-sufficient in this sense. Only God and the forms could be said to be. One might say that once created, the cosmos is ontologically self-sufficient, since it is perfectly put together and will survive forever. Yet Timaeus reminds us, at 41b, that the demiurge could in principle rescind the cosmos, though being good, he wouldn't do that. Now, the cosmology of the Timaeus is in an important sense a physics of change. Bodies are characterized by linear motions, soul by circular motion. The two sorts of motion are potentially in conflict. When human beings perceive or take nourishment, they admit the linear motions of the incoming materials, which then disturb the circular motions of the soul. Our passage is in a sense proleptic or anticipatory of those descriptions of the human case, in that it assumes that the same would happen to the world soul if it admitted of incoming motions from the outside. So, for example, the same word attack, prospiptine, used for the effect of external use of the effect that external elements would have had on the cosmos, if there had been anything outside of the cosmos, that term is used again for the effect the nourishment does have on the human being, both body and soul. The human soul then lives in a hostile environment of linear motions, which the world body and soul are spared. For us, circular rational motions are an accomplishment in that hostile environment. For the cosmic God, it is the default, given its friendly environment, or should one say lack of environment. Animal life, human or divine, is figured in terms of these two kinds of motions, circular and linear. It's no surprise then that also self-sufficiency is expressed in terms of self-motion. The cosmos has come into being, quote, in such a way that it suffered and did everything in itself and by itself. Its motions are in itself, but crucially also by itself. The point is essentially related to self-motion being circular, since, as both Plato and Aristotle saw it, only circular motion can proceed continuously forever without halting or reversing. Quite a lot of assumptions in that claim, but their preference for circular motion as the motion of the heavenly bodies is clearly dependent on the idea that circular motion can continue without stopping to do so. No external impetus is then in principle required to explain this motion's continuation. Once it's going, it's a sort of perpetuum mobile. Self-sufficiency means here then the ability to maintain its own motions without the need of external impetus. Contrast again human perception or nutrition, which does not happen unless we are affected by something else from the outside. Note, however, that despite these fundamental differences, the cosmos maintains or remains a model for human beings. Perception, when properly regulated, helps restore the circular motions thrown off their course at birth. If we observe the cosmic revolutions, we too can attain to their regularity. So there's, of course, this description around 43, 44 of vision as being the greatest gift of the gods, because it's through vision, particularly observing the regular motions of the heavenly bodies, that we have acquired our concept of number, which then enables us to calculate further all the motions of the heavenly bodies, and by doing that, we're able to replicate in our souls their harmonious proportionality and then become better, more orderly and virtuous human beings. So that, as a word, shows the two-sidedness of these bodily processes like perception. Perception at first is described as a disturbance. Indeed, the generic term for all the linear motions that approach the soul from the outside and disturb its circular regularity, the generic term for that is aesthesis, perceptions. But then when we get to the account of vision, it seems that the gods, the so-called lesser gods that have created our sense organs and our bodies, actually turn those necessary bodily processes into something good, something helpful, something that can improve our rationality. And then our eyes, properly used, will actually help us to regain those circular motions that the initial perceptions completely upturned. So it's very important to keep in mind that we are living in an environment that is hostile, but we're also given the tools through the divine interventions and the divine pronoia, the divine foresight. We're given the tools through our bodies to regulate and correct this irrationality. But my point here was primarily to do with self-motion, to understand self-sufficiency in terms of a certain kind of motion, self-motion, and to contrast that with the motion that is imposed on the outside, as perception is for human beings, at least in origin. Now, if we look at plants, we get an interesting contrasting case, both to the case of human beings, but in particular in relation to the cosmos. So here's a description of plants, which are entirely dependent on external affections. Everything that has life has every right to be called a living thing, or a zoon. Animal is the other possible translation. And the group of which we're speaking, the plants, has a third kind of soul, which we have located between midriff and navel, and which is without belief or reason or understanding, but a sense of pleasure and pain together with appetites. It is always entirely passive. Its formation has not given it the natural capacity to discern and think about what happens to it by revolving in and about itself, rejecting motion from without and exercising a motion of its own. So it is a creature with a life of its own, but it cannot move as fixed, and because it has no self-motion. So here, in a way, you have a creature stripped of any self-sufficiency, because it's stripped of any kind of self-motion by which it can initiate its own actions and, importantly, also resist whatever the external environment brings to it. So it's in a way complete pushover for the environment without any self-reliance or independence. So that's the complete contrasting case to the cosmos. Human beings are somewhere in the middle. We look towards the cosmos as our model, certainly not to plants. So humans have a choice here in a way, or at least an ability to steer our lives in one direction rather than another. And by caring for ourselves, we can obtain a degree of self-sufficiency only fully realized by the cosmos, but at least distancing us from the sorry state of plants. And one example of that is when Timaeus, towards the end of his account, talks about disease and the various kinds of motion that we can engage in to try and prevent disease. And here he says, among movements, the best is the movement in itself by itself, for it is most nearly akin to the movement of intelligence and of the universe. This looks like a reference to our passage. Next is movement produced in us by another, and worst of all is movement caused by outside agents in parts of the body while the body itself remains passive and unmoving. And that last case looks like plant perception. Timaeus' examples of A, the motion in us that is self-motion, and like the cosmic self-motion, it's physical exercise. Of B, it's rocking motions such as sea travel, and C, the last case, is the powerful influence of drugs. But in physical exercise, we imitate the cosmos with, as I said, the echo of the phrase, the movement in itself by itself, that we had in our passage. I want to end by saying a few words about friendship and self-sufficiency. So my concern has been to clarify how self-sufficiency is used to characterize some of the basic properties of the cosmos. Self-sufficiency allows for what we might consider a physical specification. As we saw, circular self-motion is the physical manifestation of self-sufficiency in the Timaeus' physics of change. But there's nothing value neutral about this specification, talking about circular self-motion. On the contrary, the physical specification serves the ethical, normative, and indeed religious determination of the cosmos as a fully happy God. It's on this note that our passage emphatically ends, when Timaeus says, so he established one heaven only, round and moving around, solitary, but because of its excellence, needing no company other than itself, and satisfied to be its own acquaintance and friend. His creation then, for all these reasons, was a blessed God. The need for friends is one of the points that makes Aristotle qualify the self-sufficiency of happiness. We saw that earlier, the need for friends and and family and so on. Or perhaps not friends of friends. We will not say that a life was happier or more complete without friends, on the contrary. But Aristotle is also clear that this is a point that follows from our human nature as social animals. Somebody who does not need friends is either beast or God. In this case, Aristotle's description is only partially appropriate to Timaeus' cosmic God. It's not that the cosmos does not need friends. That's not what Timaeus tells us. His description suggests rather that a need for friends, that it does have a need for friends, but that it is adequately satisfied by the cosmos itself. The cosmos is to this extent similar to the Aristotelian virtuous person who, because of his goodness, is a friend to himself. But the cosmos is different, since the Aristotelian virtuous person still requires other virtuous people as friends. The cosmos then has a need for friends, but it is sufficiently satisfied by its reflexive relationship to itself. The point here seems similar to the case of nutrition. The cosmos needs nutrition, but it provides it itself. Similarly, it needs friends, but it provides it itself. The friendship that the cosmos provides with itself has already been hinted at. It's the friendship of the four simple bodies with each other in a proportionate relationship. But it's also the relationship between body and soul that appears to be a harmonious one, a spherical body with the soul revolving with it. There's a sort of perfect match between the shape of the cosmic body and the shape of its soul, and the motions of the body and the soul are naturally one. There's a final point here. The cosmos is different from us, is a model for us, but it's not that different from us. The cosmos is a god, but it's also an animal, a zoon, with a soul and a body. There's therefore an implicit animal standard of comparison in our passage, saying that the cosmos lacks legs, having nowhere to go, or has no eyes, there being nothing external, no organs of digestion or excretion, is free from disease. All of these points contrast the cosmos with other animals with which we are familiar, and which which Timaeus will go on to account for in detail. The cosmos is, in other words, near enough to us in nature as an animal for its self-sufficiency to provide a model for us, something that perhaps cannot be said for the self-sufficient gods of other ancient philosophers. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this extremely interesting and stimulating talk. So we can start with the discussion. Danielle.
Oh dear, so you sent me straight away. So thank you, Thomas, for such an interesting talk. I really sympathize with what you're saying. I guess I was going to ask you about how do you think this relates to the notion of archeia as more in the sense not of completeness, but in the sense of kind of self, like independence and self-governing, and so yeah. So I guess that's kind of my first question.
Yeah, I mean, those two words are so similar, autarkeia and autarcheia, with the he and the kappa. They're very so. And they're so close to each other, some people get confused. But I mean, of course, there's an important semantic difference. The self-sufficiency and the self-ruling are not quite the same. If you have in the political context, and I started out by saying that a lot of sometimes, like in Herodotus, we get this idea that the city or the country is autarkis. Then you think, well, that surely implies self-rule as well, right? And I was trying to develop a functional understanding of self-sufficiency, according to which you are self-sufficient when you are yourself able to execute the functions that you need, and that in a way already allows for us to think of this in terms of a kind of self-rule, self-control, to get the arche bit in. So I think it's very easy to tell a continuous story about those two concepts. Yeah. Did you have anything more specific in mind?
Sorry, no, I guess I'm still trying to think about the implications of the self-sufficiency of the world soul, and how that, so what kind of lesson does that is supposed to tell us as human beings? Yeah. Because in a sense, it sounds like so it's easier to be the world soul than a human being, right? That there's more it's more price-worthy to be virtuous as a human being than as the world soul. In some sense, you might kind of think. So I was wondering whether the model, so whether we should strive to look not at directly at the world soul, but at the minor gods like the stars or something closer to our condition.
Yeah. Good. I like that. In a way, it's easier to be the world soul than it is to be a human being, because you don't have this hostile environment I was talking about. On the other hand, of course, the world soul must have a range of functions in relation to its internal organization that will occupy it. So when the cognition of the world soul is described, we have it thinking both about being, presumably the forms, but we also have it making true judgments about perceptible matters. And you might think that that's the sort of cognition involved in somehow regulating the internal mechanisms in the cosmos. I mean, I take it that this is a sort of, there's a certain element of practical thinking involved in this kind of management of the cosmos. One is that, of course, in the creation of living beings, that's delegated from the demiurge to these lesser gods, who are going to be the same as the heavenly bodies. So their thinking must somehow be reflected in their motions, and there must be somehow be the sort of thinking that results in the first case, in the creation of human beings, and further down the line, other living beings. But also there are questions to do with, for example, reincarnation and who oversees all that stuff. So I take it that it's actually quite a senior leadership job that they've got, which might give them some, I don't know about headache, because they're very practical, they're very wise, but there's certainly a job to be done there. It's not. I mean, so the demiurge is described as stepping back at some point in the place that he always rests, but there's no such
Sorry, you are muted, Thomas.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so the lesser gods are involved in some thinking, at least, which is going to be fairly comprehensive, and it's not going to be the life of the resting gods like the Epicurean gods that are just kind of doing nothing, right? But I mean, so human beings must somehow do the same in relation to themselves that the other gods are doing when they're organizing the cosmos. I mean, I refer to that passage where we have to regulate our own motions, do physical exercise, do astronomy and all those things. And in doing so, we're somehow trying to, on a microcosmic level, to repeat the order and ordering of the cosmic gods in relation to the cosmos as a whole. Right? So those jobs, in a way, parallel.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I was just kind of thinking that so it's like the lesson we learn from understanding the world soul is kind of doubled, right? So we should try to be a bit more like the world soul, but also I was thinking that it's like we also need to understand our place in the universe and our kind of place in the scala natura to kind of understand where is our limits and our powers and how to allocate our efforts consistently with that. I guess that's the only. So, but it's not that you're saying anything against that or
no, on the contrary, I think I agree with you. And I mean, my sense of, and I think this is something that hasn't really been brought out sufficiently in scholarship on the Timaeus, is that there's a huge, in a way, a huge distance between man and God. If you look at man and the demiurge, let alone the form of the good, if you think that's God. But with the lesser gods, the creative gods that create us, we have a different relationship. And remember that the demiurge says to the lesser gods that they should nourish us, they should take care of us. And of course, they also create us, at least the mortal side of our nature. So they are our guardians. They're the ones, and they're the ones that we imitate. We're told to imitate the heavenly bodies, right? Not directly God. And this idea that we have somehow an intermediate representation of the divine in the lesser gods that somehow creates models for us in a way that a higher, more abstract, purely intellectual God couldn't. I think that's an important aspect of the work. And then you can, and that's why at the end I was sort of trying to contrast also the cosmos as a model for us with, I think, both Aristotle's God, I mean, the first unmoved mover is much more, I mean, I know at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, we have the homoiosis thought, we have the idea that through contemplation we imitate the first unmoved mover, but it's a much more difficult job. I mean, there's much greater distance because this God is a purely intellectual God, whereas the cosmos as a model involves not just thinking rationally, but also having opinions and even digesting. Right. So there's a lot of animal aspects to that. It's an animal model, those still are God. Right? Or the Epicurean gods that are far removed and not like us either. So.
Thank you. I'll let others ask you the questions.
Thanks, Daniel.
So are there other questions, Victor?
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for your presentation or talk. I would have 3 questions. if possible, if it would be possible to answer them kind of briefly. The first one would be something that you brought up at the very beginning of the talk. That was the textual statement that for the world to be perfect or as good as possible, it needs to have reason, and in order to in order for it to have has reason, it needs to have a soul as well. So I would like to know at which to which camp, so to say, do you belong, in the sense of accepting as a Platonic tenet that every intellect must be in soul, or on the other hand, believing that there can be an unensouled intellect, which would be the demiurge, for example. So that might be a complex question, but it is the first one I'd like to know. The second is related to the idea that the world is not all the elements, all the elements were used up, and there is nothing outside of it. So I'm interested to hear a bit more precisely what your opinion on this is, and how do you understand, because we know that there is no void in the Platonic cosmos. So would you accept the possibility of existent void outside of cosmos, or should we just picture the Platonic world as simply, in a sense, as the Parmenidean being, which is one and all in all there is, at least because we know that also all the space or the chora is used up in the creation of the cosmos. So I guess you you get my point. And finally, the third question is kind of a doubt. I mean, it seems to me that perhaps a bit of an overstatement to say that the cosmos as a god needs friends and nutrition, because there's lots of poetry and figurative talk involved in the Timaeus, and specifically in the passage under discussion. So I mean, my doubt would be that actually it is just a way Plato is putting things, while in fact self-sufficiency and independence in this context means exactly that there is no need of either friendship or nutrition for the world. And yes, that would be that. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are great questions. I'm not sure I can answer what I think, but I'm not sure I can answer in a way that will persuade anybody. So on the first question, I mean, I think as far as the text goes, it's consistent with the sort of Stephen Wen Hackforth line on this. That's to say that it's possible to be intellect without having a soul, but it's not possible to have an intellect without having a soul. Right? So, of course, that's the reading is carefully constructed to reflect the text as it stands. So the question is a bit: what are the philosophical problems one might run into if one adopts that line? I mean, one thing is, of course, the relationship to life. So if we say that God is nous but doesn't have nous, and for that reason doesn't have soul either, then you might think that it's going to be difficult to characterize God as living. And that is a characterization that one gets also in Aristotle. And similarly then having a soul, right? I mean, it's, and being an animal, all these, or living being, those things, again, as I said, those go out the window in a way. And that may seem a cost to pay that one doesn't want to pay. Why would one be motivated to deny that the highest God has intellect, has soul? Well, I mean, it may be that one wants to, as well, allow for certain other things. And one could be the identification of God with a form. You might want to understand God in a way that allows for a stronger kind of identity between thought and thought object than is available if you also want God to have a soul that provides some sort of, as well, substrate for that intellect. So that could be one reason why one wants to go in that direction. And I can see the attraction of that in a way, because one needs to be able to conceive of a very close identity between nous and the noeta. Certainly in Aristotle, but also possibly in the Timaeus, where God too is referred to as the best of the noeta. So I don't have any firmer opinion than that as well, but I'm interested in as it were, tracking the costs and the benefits of either choice, given that I think the reading is possible given the text. All the elements being used up and void of no void outside the cosmos. So I was trying in a way to suggest that some of the description of the cosmos makes better sense if there's an assumption that there could be something outside of the cosmos. I mean, it's in a way this brings us back to how we understand chora as well.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you might think that chora means something like place for body or potential place for body, something that is sort of fillable by body. When Timaeus denies that there's void, what exactly is he denying? I don't think he's denying that there can be empty place that something moves into. I think the thought is rather that whenever there is such a thing, there are mechanisms within the cosmos that ensure that empty space in the chora will be filled. So in a way, that's not a sort of it's not a sort of a principled kind of denial of there being empty space. It's just saying that there's a conception here of chora and the way stuff moves around in the chora that means that any space will be filled. And of course, that also involves the centripetal force of the world soul that packs things together within the chora. But it seems like that there are mechanisms that are somewhat drawn in to explain why this void will be filled in a way that suggests that it's not that there's some sort of basic conceptual problem with the very idea of there being empty space. I mean, then you can ask, how does this apply to the outside of the cosmos? I mean, Timaeus doesn't say anything about that. I mean, is there chora outside of the cosmos? I mean, if you look at the pre-cosmic description of Chora, it's full of these ichne, these traces moving around up and down and so on, right? And the Chora works in relation to that as the winnowing basket, right? Now, if the thought is that the demiurge has taken all these traces and organized them, put mathematical structure on them, and then, as we're made that cosmos out of that, then that might suggest that there's nothing outside of it either, in the sense of sort of either of ichne traces moving around and some Chora outside of that. I don't see Timaeus denying that there's empty space outside of the cosmos, but I don't see him either implying or suggesting that there's Chora outside of the cosmos. So it becomes a very, very intractable question, put like that. And your final point about the overstatement, I think it's nice to have that sober perspective. I think I need to, as it were, persuade somebody who says what you just said. On the other hand, I think the description of the cosmos as a god, as eudaimon, as a zoon, create all the sort of conditions for a subject of which one can predicate self-sufficiency and friendship too, given that this is an intelligent living being that is happy, that one is appropriate to have the sorts of ethical expectations, a characterization of the good life for such an entity, that means that one can talk about as being self-sufficient. And particularly in this tradition of thinking of God as self-sufficient, which is really quite strong before and after Plato. It seems to me almost like once you talk about the cosmos as a god, there's an expectation that whether and how it is autarkes will be answered. At least that's my sort of interpretive assumption. So read this.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a very brief note with regard to the your answer to my first question. So I would just think that probably the main motivation why people wanted to posit an independent nous, it might have been the idea to dissociate it from the world soul, because this was a very common identification of the demiurge.
Yeah.
So this is the only thing I wanted to say. Thank you.
I think that's right. And I would like to dissociate the demiurge too from the world soul. But of course, it's possible to have a soul that isn't created. And we have the problem of the Phaedras as well in the background. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or remarks? Yes, Daniel.
So if anyone else wants to ask something, but I just want to ask something very brief, which is about the statesman. And I would want to know what you think about this self-sufficiency in the Timaeus with relation to the cosmological myth in the statesman. There we have so the world requires the kind of active intervention of God to remain immortal, right? And you might think that is a less sufficient world than the one in the Timaeus. But as you also said, the demiurge in the Timaeus can, at least in principle, destroy the world or something like that. And although he doesn't have to actively intervene to restore the immortality of the world, there is still some kind of space or some way to say, well, then that's not a absolute self-sufficiency in a way, because in both models you still depend on the goodwill of the demiurge or something like that. So I guess my question is, if you see things in this kind of way, or do you think that the self-sufficiency in the statesman works in a different way?
That's a great question. I mean, I've thought about the relationship between the statesman and the Timaeus on this point about God's role in maintaining, or as you might say, propping up the cosmos. But I haven't really thought about it in terms of self-sufficiency, which I should. I have to admit, I haven't actually spent many months thinking about self-sufficiency as such. So if you think of decay, for example, as an example of lack of self-sufficiency, it's clear that there's a process of decay, gradual loss of order and internal structure in the cosmos, in our age, the age of Zeus, and at some point you will get God intervening because he sees that the ship is just going off course, so you could figure that as a gradual kind of loss of self-sufficiency, as when we get older in a way, and we get more and more dependent on our surroundings to prop us up. I mean, there's an underlying question about, I mean, so one way you could put it is that in the Timaeus, the destruction of the world remains a kind of counterfactual. It's there, implicit in the idea of the cosmos being phatos. It's destructible given that it's generated. I mean, you can't have one without the other. It's just so well done that it won't happen unless there's external interference, and God wouldn't do that. While in the statesman, it's not at least within the myth, I mean, that's reading the myth literally, it's not a counterfactual, but it is an actual historical development. Has happened, will happen again. So, I mean, one can say that in a way, in the description of the cosmos, there's no contradiction between the two. It's just that the statesman fulfills a potential that the world has anyway, also given the Timaeus account. But there does seem to be a difference in that the Timaeus thinks that the world's soul is so well organized, so rational, so in charge. Coming back to your point about arche, I mean, it really rules the matter, and not completely, but to at least to such an extent that it's able to maintain the structure by its own accord, on its own accord, and that gives us a different sense of this stronger, ultimately a stronger sense of self-sufficiency as well in the Timaeus than you get in the statesman.
So, Eduardo.
Thank you, Thomas, for your paper.
Hi.
Good to see you too. I have a question, and excuse me if I missed this in your talk I have a question about understanding the sense in which the cosmos is one, and how that could be, and so let me just backtrack. Towards the end, you said that your concern was to understand how self-sufficiency is used to characterize the basic properties of the cosmos. And I have an idea, but I would like to hear a bit more about how self-sufficiency helps to explain the unity of the cosmos, and perhaps in the context of how that could be a model for human beings to become one, seeing how, at least in the Republic, becoming one soul out of many parts is a formidable and desirable thing.
Yep.
Thank you.
So are you going to give me your proposal, or?
I mean, the thought, and it's not. I don't think it's not particularly deep. It's that, and I think it might hit upon the Epicurean line you were mentioning earlier. It's basically to minimize our needs or functions to those at which we can satisfy by ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, I guess like one worry that I have in the back of my head is whether we should. It seems like we should not understand the cosmos to be one in the sense of being indivisible. And that's perhaps what I'm not entirely sure about.
Yeah, I think we have quite complex lives, and we have a tripartite soul, and we have a body. And Tamias tells us in some detail how we need to attend to both soul and body in its various aspects. So it's not like we can afford to ignore any aspect of our embodied nature. So that makes the task quite complex. I mean, I was talking about exercise as an example of how you imitate the self-motions of the cosmos. But of course, that's only part of it. I mean, we have the most important bit is, of course, the bit we're doing when we're thinking about the heavenly bodies and trying to figure out our intellectual motions. But all of those need to be in play in terms of our embodied nature. And I think I take a slight issue with some commentators who have, I think, a very highly intellectualized view of what it means to imitate God. I think, and this was part of the subtext of this paper, that I think for us to imitate God means also to imitate the cosmic body, not just the cosmic soul in its rational perfection, but we have bodily processes that are also involved, and the case of exercise is a good one. So it's embodied nature that needs to be regulated and be the focus also when we imitate the divine. So how simple can our lives be? Well, not very simple, I think. Going back to the Republic, of course, we have this idea of the city of pigs, right? Which seem to be overly simple in terms of human nature. I mean, there's no culture, so there's nothing really for the mind or the intellect there, but nor is there anything really for the spirit, because there's no conflict, and nor is there really much for the appetites either. And I think, we have a complex human nature that needs to be exercised in these different ways. So I think our self-sufficiency will in a way be restricted by having to do all those things in relation to the environment. Though the gods have helped us by creating bodies that can do wonderful things like looking at the stars or move a right way and so on. So, I mean, you can think of this, of course, also in terms of Aristotle. Self-sufficiency is an ideal, a criterion that regulates both the practical life and the theoretical life. The theoretical life is, without going into any debates, it's sort of borderline human. It's sort of both human and not human. But it's quite clear that we could not possibly just live that life. We need to live the practical life as well and obtain self-sufficiency in the manner appropriate to that, in the manner appropriate to us being political animals. And that's going to be a complicated thing, much more than it is for an Epicurean god or somebody who, very simplified, lives in the Epicurean garden.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, there's only a few minutes, but.
So are there other questions or remarks? Thomas, yes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Vaguely, not very well.
Okay. It is better now?
No.
Okay. Okay, I will speak out loudly so that you can hear me. So thanks for your talk. It was really fascinating. Actually, I have two remarks, and I would be interested what you would say about that. The first thing is that, as you know, many scholars claim that the Timaeus is actually, in the end, an ethical dialogue. And I always struggled with this claim, but maybe with your interpretation, this can make much sense, I think. Yeah, this was the first remark. The second remark is that when you talked about toteleon and motion, I thought about Aristotle's distinction between kinesis and energia in Theta 6. And he says there that energia is teleon while kinesis is not. And an example for an energia, which is teleon, is living a happy life. and this maybe can be another connection between these two accounts.
Yeah. I like that very much. I mean, of course, Plato doesn't have the Aristotelian concept of energia. But what he does have, which also Aristotle has, is the notion of circular change. And I think in many ways, circular change is supposed to do the job that Aristotle by energia can clarify conceptually. So you have a motion that is complete at any point of its circulation. You have a motion that doesn't stop. Right? So, of course, that's very important also when we think about God and Aristotle's God, that it is continuous activity. Aristotle will criticize. There's a difference between the activity of the first unmoved mover and the first moved movers, which are engaged in circular motion. So circular motion is not quite enough for Aristotle to get a pure instantiation of activity or actuality as such, of the sort illustrated by the first unmoved mover. But it's still the closest thing you get in a way, even within Aristotle's system. And I think it's tempting to think that in Plato, Plato wants some of that to be done by circular motion. It is, a scholar put it like this, it's the kind of kinesis that is least like kinesis. Yeah. So I like that very much, and then that also applies to happiness as a continuous activity, and that's part of the motivation for this, as as circular change, circular self-motion. Thank you for that. I mean, that's definitely worth bringing in and using. Yeah. I mean, how should we categorize different Platonic works? I mean, I don't know how interesting it is in itself to say that the Timaeus is an ethical work. And I think that there's an interesting point about the relationship between the Timaeus and the Republic, given that these are in some ways closely related. And there's the ancient tradition that says that the Timaeus does more physico, what the Republic does more politico or ethico. But that is a false distinction in a way, both because there's some physics in the Republic. I wrote an article on this called Timaeus in the Cave, but also because there's all this ethics going into the Timaeus. And how could it not be? I mean, it's take the starting point. What is the Timaeus trying to do? Is trying to show the creation of the cosmos down to man, so that we have the background or the context for the Atlantis story, which is about showing Socrates' virtuous citizens from the Republic in action. So there's already that kind of context in a way, and then when you factor in that you have a God that created the world because he was good and the world should be good, right? I mean, there's already this starting point, and it goes all the way through to the selection of the geometrical figures that the four simple bodies will be made out of, chosen on the basis of there being the Callister, the most beautiful. So you cannot separate the ethical, the normative, or even the political. We're talking about philia and so on, and the description of disease as internal strife and all that. I mean, that's kind of translating into natural philosophy what you had in the Republic. So I cannot, I just think these distinctions become a bit silly.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there other remarks, questions? No? Okay, so let's thank our speaker again for talk, and Thomas, let's hope to meet in person at some point. We will be able again to reconvene in person in conferences and so on. So
very
stay
much.
safe, take care.
I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, Thomas.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.